Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. We are stepping away from the series of episodes that we recorded at Oxford, but we have other shows from that trip that we'll be posting soon. But today we're going to talk about something that's kind of timely to talk about because of the nature of what we're going to be talking about, as you're going to learn in a minute. But instead of getting ahead of myself, let me just introduce myself. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. And relevant to this conversation, I was a professor of philosophy teaching on an adjunct basis at Eastern Nazarene College for about a decade. And that's important for reasons related to the subject of the conversation today. But also, I'm a senior editor for Touchstone Magazine, and I'm also a contributing writer at World Magazine, both for the print and online editions. And I submitted an editorial to the magazine concerning the subject of our show today. So that's, again, a connection that's important to make.
Sure.
Anyway, let me kick it over to you, Tom, and let you introduce yourself.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I teach philosophy and other things at other institutions, some of which have been also impacted by things we'll be talking about today.
Yeah. I think it's something we can take for granted that we've all been impacted by what we're going to be talking about today. It's been a theme of a number of shows. Okay, Glenn, go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I escaped from being a college professor at Central Connecticut State University. I'm a historian specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. I work for Reflections Ministries. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I also run my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries.
Another thing that's good for folks to know, Glenn, about you is not only were you at Central Connecticut State, before that you taught at at Calvin.
Yeah, I taught at Calvin for 2 years while someone else was deaning. The Reformation historian, Frank Roberts, was dean, and they needed somebody to fill in for him.
Awesome. But I guess that's relevant because Christian colleges are institutions you're familiar with and actually spent some time in one.
Right. Yep.
Anyway, well, we have an old friend of mine on the show today. This is Dr. Phil LaFountain. Phil and I go way back. We were in college together. We were in one graduate program together, and we actually worked together in Boston for years. And we taught both at Eastern Nazarene College and on an adjunct basis, and then Phil went on to become a full-time professor there. Phil, great to see you. Why don't you introduce yourself? Let people know a little bit about you.
Sure. Good to be with you, Chris and Glenn and Thomas. Thank you very much. So I've been teaching theology and philosophy at Eastern Nazarene College since 2003. I was brought on full-time adjunct and then full-time professor tenure track at 2004. But as Chris already mentioned, we taught in adult and graduate studies, at least for me a decade before that, and pastored a Nazarene Church in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And Chris and I worked together at Cambridge Institute. He hired me. That was sort of a lapse in his judgment there for a brief period of time. But it was a wonderful ride. It was a wonderful time, and I had a great time working with him there. So, we've been colleagues and friends for a long time, and I've admired Chris ever since we got to know each other. And this topic we're going to talk about is obviously touches all of us, but it's something that really has to be addressed. And a lot of people are just avoiding the question. So I'm looking forward to a conversation. Obviously, I was employed at Eastern Nazarene College until about a week ago when it was announced that ENC was closing. Talk more about that if you wish.
Yeah. Well, that is the subject of the show today. Not just what took place at Eastern Nazarene College, but larger trends that are affecting higher education, not just theological education, but higher education, generally speaking, at both secular and Christian schools. And I think that the fact that Eastern Nazarene College has made the announcement that it's closing its doors provides us with, I think, an event to reflect on, at least for Phil and me, that is, an occasion for sadness for us.
Yes.
But also, I think, signals, I think, pretty clearly that the things that are going on in higher education generally, and specifically at Christian schools, requires, I think, or provides an occasion for some reflection. And that's what I like to do today a bit. So let's just kind of jump into the kind of the waters at Eastern Nazarene College. So Eastern Nazarene College, for folks who are unfamiliar with the school, and we've got about 15,000 listeners around the world, and most of our listeners will be unfamiliar with the school.
Yeah,
So
sure.
to give a little bit of background on it, it was a school that was affiliated with the Church of the Nazarene, which is a church in the Wesleyan theological holiness tradition.
Right.
I was converted and became a Christian in a Nazarene Church and served in the Church of the Nazarene as a teaching elder for about 20 years or so before I became reformed in my convictions and moved to the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA. But I have wonderful experiences to reflect on in the Nazarene world. I have great fondness for the people that make up that world, and many wonderful memories of Eastern Nazarene College. At the same time, when Phil and I were in Boston, Phil noted that there was an institution that we both worked at called Cambridge Institute. I founded that. It's obviously, it had its beginnings in Cambridge, but we were involved with the work of educating people in the inner city, as we used to call it back in the day. Largely people who were recent immigrants to the United States.
Right.
The students that we were working with were Haitians and Dominicans and Jamaicans and people from El Salvador and even other parts of the world like India. And we did that for about a decade. And it was a ton of fun. And we were affiliated loosely with Eastern Nazarene College, but also with other schools in the area. There was never any formal connection, but there were a lot of relationships that we had built with people at those schools to help our students matriculate into those other schools when they were done with us. Right. And Phil did a lot of teaching at Cambridge Institute and did a lot of administrative work. Yeah. And it was a lot of fun for us to be together, particularly since we had both gone to schools together before that, including Eastern Nazarene College. Yes. In terms of my time at Eastern Nazarene College, it was formative for me. I was involved in student government. I was in, I played varsity soccer for the school, represented the school that way. And that's where I met my wife. And my wife, her family has a long history with Eastern Nazarene College. Right. Her grandfather was the chairman of the religion department, Harvey Judson Smith Blaney. Yeah. And not only was he the chairman of the religion department, he did it twice. He was the chairman of the department, retired, and then they needed him back, and he came back. And he was actually there my freshman year. And he took a real interest in me because I had taken an interest in his granddaughter. So he was watching me. We got to know each other, and we had a great relationship. He was an interesting guy. I mean, he had degrees from BU, Yale, and Harvard. And one of the fun things is I'm an alum of Harvard Divinity School, and I'm in the same alumni handbook, or the list, which lists all the alumni of Harvard Divinity School, and I'm in the same book as him.
That's awesome,
because it goes all the way back to the beginning. I mean, it's like it takes you back to like the 19th century and earlier. So anyway, so it's the full list. But anyway, when we were there and at Eastern Nazarene College working together, we saw the beginnings of what today we refer to as DEI, or what I like to refer to as DIE. And, basically the initial impetus was, I think, well-intended or well-intentioned, building bridges to kids and people and communities that for whom opportunities in higher education were just not considered available. Right. So we were trying to make those connections, but things went way beyond that eventually. And I remember when I was at Harvard, I remember talking to you a little bit about what I anticipated being the future for higher education, generally speaking, based on what I was seeing on the ground there.
Mm.
And I noted that what was, in full bloom there, and what I mean by bloom, I don't mean like pretty flowers. I mean like stinking, ugly, weedy stuff.
Right.
Was going to spread, and it was even going to be, sort of take root at places like Eastern Nazarene College, and that. And my conviction was at that time, not just that that the Church of the Nazarene didn't have the theology that would be up to the task of resisting the incursions, but I think.
Right.
But I thought, generally speaking, evangelicalism didn't have what it took, more broadly speaking, to resist the incursions intellectually that we would see. Anyway, that's my take on things.
Yeah.
But I want to kick it over to you, Phil, because you were on the ground at Eastern Nazarene College and saw the weeds.
Yeah. When you're immersed in that atmosphere, you're immersed in that culture. It's the air that you breathe. And it really is. I mean, obviously it's probably overused, but the image of the frog in the kettle, right? Is really apropos, though. I mean, there's a sense in which you're in the culture. Now, I was at ENC, so we're both alums. I was there from 81 to 85. But even then, Chris, and we think about, what were the influences? So I should add here that even though I've been trained in Christian theology and philosophy, and taught both of those trajectories at ENC, I was fortunate during my time at Boston University, doing a doctoral degree there, that I actually minored in sociology of religion. And I reject, of course, the modernist assumptions of sociology. Still, it's a tool, right? It's a lens. It's a way of viewing, which I find valuable. So what I'm trying to do right now is step back, as you mentioned, step back a bit, right? And look at the bigger picture. So I'm looking at ENC and its transition from about 30 to 40 years ago, maybe even a little bit more than that. So I want to make the distinction. Here, let me just lay out my thesis for you, as I'm thinking about this. And I think it's a valid one. The quibble that people have is, well, how extensive is this, Phil, right? How much does it really matter? I think it matters a lot. So my basic thesis is that over the 30 and 40 years, at least, of the history of ENC, and probably is true for other evangelical schools too, is that a bifurcation, a separation developed between academia and the local church, the local congregation, the local, pastors. And so the idea is that gradually over time, the faculty at Eastern Nazarene College became more liberal, more secular, and more progressive. And then they didn't even realize it, right? It was the air that they breathed. And, they imbibed those secular assumptions in sociology and history and psychology and the hard sciences, of course, dealing with matters of neo-Darwinian evolution, those kinds of things. But history, and then, of course, the arts as well, a number of these assumptions, and people began changing, and they think differently. And we call that interface between modernity and evangelicalism, right? Or Christianity, Protestant liberalism, right? Goes back to Schleiermacher, of course, then through. So, Chris knows well that our theology professor in the 80s at Eastern Nazarene College was a Tillichian. He embraced Paul Tillich, right? So. Right. He probably didn't have a orthodox traditional bone in his body, right? So later,
I didn't think Tillich was even popular in the 80s.
Exactly, right? And so, but I had just become a Christian, so I became a Christian in 1978. I was in the military, in the Air Force, and so I was 2 years into being a Christian, and then get thrust into this, this theological milieu at the college. And I had no clue what I was doing. I confess that. I was over my head. Some of you grew up in the church, but really I didn't get my theological voice until well after seminary, because I was trying to figure all this stuff out. And then, of course, you can imagine the confusion, getting Tillich in my classes and trying to figure, well, how does he relate to the Bible? What's going on?
That's
How does he seem quite right here, So,
well, that's if I may for a quick second, because there's a very, very good point here. And I think it often gets lost. It's the way in which we're immersed in a few different types of formation that make this kind of slow process very easy. One is a lot of the people that are educating us have been immersed in secular universities or divinity schools that have been so impacted by them with the latest trends that they absorb it, and usually as students, so they don't have the critical apparatus to engage that material from a critically orthodox position because they're just earning their wings. And so they absorb it, and then they come, and it's natural to them when they start teaching it to a lot of people. And then to the other people, even people who grow up in the church with a basic kind of foundation, they have something more to work with. But it's often cloaked in language that sounds as though this is just really where the Bible would go if we had taken it to this current moment. And so it's easy to get sucked into that void.
Absolutely.
And without a kind of really rich formation and grounding, it's very difficult to resist.
Yeah. Well, I want to just jump in here and say a couple things to kind of, again, frame this for our audience. So Eastern Nazarene College closed here recently. When Phil and I were students there, it was a vibrant, jumping, happening place. There was a lot of, I think, life among the students and the faculty. You noted, Phil, that there were some people to have been concerned about, or we should have been concerned about, who were in the religion department. But generally speaking, throughout the larger sort of community, we still had a lot of the folks who had been there for years and years, who were old-fashioned and kind of dyed-in-the-wool church people who were academics, but they were, I think, committed to the denomination that the college had been established to serve. I mean, they thought of themselves as churchmen and church women first, and saw this as the place where they were called to serve. And at the end, you had a situation that, from the outside, I wasn't on the ground like you were, but from the outside appeared to have been taken over by a foreign ideology and was employing just about any means it could to further that ideology under the sort of the superficial, under a superficial facade, or I'm repeating myself, under a facade, being true to the school's theological heritage. But the people in the churches by that time were not sending their kids to the school, or many of them weren't. And many of the churches no longer were supporting the school. It felt like it had betrayed them. And what you're getting at is, what was the situation like even in our time at the school that provided the kind of the soil within which these weeds could take root and grow?
That's right. That's right.
We might want to say a quick word about Tillich. I mean, we've mentioned him, but a lot of our audience probably is not too terribly familiar with him.
We can be grateful for that.
Fortunately,
if memory.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, when I was in college back in the 70s, Tillich was probably on his way down in terms of his influence by then, in the late 70s. And if memory serves, he was the guy who was arguing for a death of God theology. So
I think that was Alitzer, but it's not a big step. It's not.
Tillich was right in that zone. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Yes, so and part of that liberal Protestant tradition that tended to privilege, and for Tillich, he privileged existentialism, right, as a philosophy, and reinterpreted the Bible, reinterpreted the experiences, the spiritual experiences of Scripture in light of this secular philosophical approach called existentialism. And of course, in order to do that, and you make Jesus, God, the ground of all being. Jesus has this God consciousness, very similar to Schleiermacher's assertion about Jesus, But you do have to question Jesus' divinity. You have to question the incarnation. You have to question a host of other Orthodox doctrines. Obviously, the reality of the Holy Spirit, And you're right. It was actually, as I think back on it, it's rather surprising that this professor continued still in the 80s to espouse what I believe was a dying, and if not dead, theology, because by the time you get into the 80s, existentialism is waning as well, right?
Right.
And so, wow, what do you do with that? But we know, a little bit of the story after this professor leaves Eastern Nazarene College, has a bit of his own existential crisis and a spiritual crisis, and begins to espouse radical orthodoxy, finally coming to his senses and beginning to see, the ways that he served the church were not as faithful as he had hoped or thought, right? I'm going to try to be as kind as I can.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it. I hadn't heard those things about him, that he had moved over to radical orthodoxy. That's
quite a leap in another direction.
Right. John Milbank, and others.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But because I didn't know anything about philosophy, I was terrified of this guy, right? And what do you're this big guy, both stature and physical stature, But I got a chance to be at a conference with him about I'd say 10-12 years later, or maybe a little bit longer, and after his transformation, and it was wonderful, right? Really way to reconnect. He told me a story, and and I told him that he caused me all kinds of pain and sorrow, and and he actually asked forgiveness for that, right? He was
really?
Wow. Yeah. So that was really cool in that sense.
Great.
But you're right, Chris.
But he wasn't the only one.
No,
we know he was like of the gang of four.
Yeah, the gang. Well, that's a good way to put it, right? I mean, the philosopher who actually, the philosopher ended up being quite liberal, who actually did his doctoral work in Karl Rahner's understanding of love, but was himself more of a secular, religious philosopher. Probably leaned towards Catholicism, and of course, with Karl Rahner, that would have been more of a phenomenological, Heideggerian, kind of approach. But anyways, without going into that, but I learned a lot from him. I mean, some of my favorite professors were the eccentric ones, right? Having that philosophy, and I learned tons of. He taught wonderful. Professor taught well.
Oh yeah.
And I learned a lot. It's just that, his own basic approach was not resonant with what I understood to be and what I said now to be, the traditional Wesleyan holiness theology at the time, more conservative, right? So, but Chris, go back to that thesis. You're right. So. What I want to argue is that this happened over time, right? You see the seeds in the 70s and the 80s. You had people actually in the 70s talking about secular forms of social justice that Nazarene should embrace, right? In that Wesleyan tradition. But gradually it began to heat up. Gradually, the soup began to thicken, right? And the atmosphere became more and more liberal Protestant. And we can talk about some of the factors of that, right? Skepticism about the biblical text itself, the current position of the Church Nazarene on Scripture, the spiritual message is inerrant, but the biblical text, and not so much, right? Which is a barn door that I've seen people drive Mack trucks through, right?
Right.
And a host of things until gradually, you're right, Chris. By the time we get into the 2000s, right, 2008, 2009, 2010, and after, a growing divide between the liberal, Protestant, secularized, for the most part, faculty and that traditional, conservative, evangelical, I've seen all the numbers, Nazarene pastors, the vast majority, 80+%, are conservative in their view of the Bible, if not fundamentalist. They're conservative in their politics, in their economics, in their sociology, society, and so are the members of their pews, right? And they just saw these things happening at their college and could not fathom how that could happen at their school, and just began, we'll talk about the details if you want, but began to lose trust and confidence and hope. And although to their credit, they did try to push back, but were thwarted, and until ultimately they had to make some radical choices, and they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in other denominations where you see a similar sort of thing happening, I'm thinking, for example, of the Lutherans. My wife grew up in a Lutheran church. What was going on in the seminaries had nothing to do with what was going on in the congregations.
Right.
And it's the same dynamic, except there, ultimately, the liberals ended up winning and taking over the congregations.
Yeah. Interesting, Glenn, on that. Similarly, with my early days were in the Baptist denomination, and I remember I went to seminary at the first, basically, generation of those that took the seminaries out back from the liberal direction. But within a generation or two, they're almost going right back down the same path. And do you know, the interesting thing is, it really came through a different way of accommodating modernity and its appetites. And that was through a very strong push towards becoming culturally relevant in the sense of marketing out the faith, to where the churches almost look like, going to the shopping mall where you can pick and choose everything, for your own self-realization if you want. And it has basically, you've seen those same seminaries that were so strong on bringing back to their own kind of biblical orthodoxy cave within a generation or two, now to where social justice in this kind of, this contemporary form, and we know it's dated, but it's fashionable in those circles. So they've been cultivated in the churches to almost ready themselves also for this kind of theology. And then they're expecting that theology to match the fashions in the churches. It's a strange mix after fighting so hard to resist it from a different, time.
And what you're talking about, Tom, is in the Southern Baptist Convention. So, the Baptists come in 500 different flavors.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But when you think about Al Mohler and what happened in the 80s and sort of like the conservative resurgence, but you're right. What you had occur in the 90s and the early 2000s was this, liberalism is going to take root in the SBC through the church growth movement, through marketing, through
McGavern, and then the Rick Warrens and the like.
All that kind of stuff. So I think there are certain parallels to what you see in the Nazarene world. I think Nazarenes, you could say, are kind of like Baptistic. I know they wouldn't like this description, but kind of Baptistic Methodists, in the sense that the theology is Wesleyan and has a kind of, it's got heritage roots in the Methodist tradition, but is very much an American phenomenon, and because it's a 19th century holiness camp meeting kind of revivalist phenomenon.
And that's where the free church sort of feel came about in the Church of the Nazarene. And that's the American kind of influence, and actually one that I tried to sort of reclaim. I don't know if this is the right time to go into a little bit of the history here theologically, but
sure, go for it, Phil.
Yeah. So, but the larger backdrop in the denomination is it took the Church of Nazarene a bit longer for modernity and secularism to sort of seep into affect us. We sort of had that sectarian kind of shield, right? And Chris understands very well that when his wife was growing up and my wife was growing up in the church, it was all about Nazarene, right? You slept Nazarene, you acted Nazarene, you talked Nazarene, and then you sent your kids to Nazarene school, and it was a rite of passage. But theologically, what happened is that the theology that our church was born with in 1908, that emerged out of that theological ferment of the 19th century holiness movement, which was a sort of a rebuttal of the Methodist, new theology and new science, and both retaining the traditional teaching of John Wesley, but also reimagining it, right? Kind of giving that American pragmatic stamp to it.
Right. Definitely.
Right. That's critical, right? The camp meetings and all that sort of thing. And I still attend a camp meeting in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and I was the president of that camp meeting. Obviously, things have changed, but that history is still there. But that theology began eroding, say, by the time you get into the 60s, the late 50s and 60s. Mildred Bangs Wynkoop was a professor of theologian in the Church of Nazarene and there was a movement to kind of go back to Wesley. So by the 70s, we began to realize that maybe something wasn't quite right in the church, right? We've lost something, or, the idea of eradication of the sinful nature, was unsettling for many people. Having some one experience at the altar on Sunday night, where you're sanctified, you're blessed, and that's a one and done deal. And so she developed this theme of plausibility, right? A plausibility gap, a credibility gap. That people professed this wonderful experience on Sunday night, but when they sinned on Wednesday morning, they weren't sure exactly. And it's a great question. If you believe that God eradicated the sinful nature Sunday night, you had a powerful experience, emotional, and, well, what do you do with that question when you think you did something wrong on Wednesday? You've only got two options. You either call it sin, or you say God did not sanctify you Sunday night, right? And so they chose not to call it sin, right? They chose to say, well, it's not sin, it was my infirmity or my humanity, right? And so more and more we had to make that infirmity area a whole lot bigger, right? And of course, then what was sin shrank quite a bit, Well, then you get people like a student of Mildred Bangs Wynkoop, H. Ray Dunning, and this development of the relationalist, right? That sin is reinterpreted in an ontology of relation rather than substance. And then but that only lasted for a short time. Somehow Dunning and the relationalist, his relational approach, did speak to the baby boomers. They did not leave the church like the mainline churches did, right? And the baby boomers stayed, but they went quiet, right? They went kind of underground, and they kind of were at the back burner and left this question of holiness on the back burner until they got into leadership. Then they couldn't leave it on the back burner anymore. They were forced to kind of think biblically and theologically about really the doctrine of entire sanctification, the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of grace is implicated as well. How is sin, original sin, relational? How is grace relational now and interpreted? But that fell apart by the time we get into the 80s, right? And it was already falling apart, Chris, when we were at ENC, right?
Sure.
And by the early 90s, everybody knew that there was some fatal flaws in relational theology. By then, Dunning had his grace, faith, and holiness. That was rejected as the theology of the church and became a representative theology of the church. But it was already on the outs by then. And by the late 80s and early 90s, the church began fracturing quite a bit. You get multiple. So by the time I studied the church in about 2002 to 2010, there were already 6 pretty well-established views of holiness. And so we didn't know what to believe, right? You know,
Yeah. Well, let's stop there and just reflect on this for a moment, Phil, because, you know, we're pretty well into the weeds on the Nazarene world and its sort of ground.
Sure.
But there are parallels, I think, that are worth noting, that maybe people can connect, or maybe there are ways that we can help people connect.
Good.
So what you have in the Nazarene world is kind of a crisis when it comes to its reason for existence.
Yes.
You've got this crisis in its theological, you know, its cardinal doctrine.
Agreed.
The thing that people pointed to and to say that's the reason why our denomination exists.
Right.
Now you go from a sort of a community, the sectarian world that you described, where everybody just kind of breathes, and sleeps. I'm a Nazarene. To what is a Nazarene?
Yeah, right.
And they got 6 different theories, and then what that does is that creates enough open space for some really weird stuff to start happening.
Yeah.
And in the Nazarene world, that weird stuff, at least one expression of it, is open theism.
Yeah.
And we have a mutual acquaintance that became kind of the personification of that view in the Wesleyan world, but also has continued to have influence elsewhere beyond that circle, and also opens the door for, I think, cultural fads or movements in the larger culture to be to work their way in. So when we think about what occurred during, say, COVID and the George Floyd riots and all that kind of stuff, and Black Lives Matter, it just pours right into Eastern Nazarene College, almost unfiltered.
Yes, agreed.
And then that's because by that point there's no filter. It's been broken down to the point where we can't even critically assess these larger social movements.
Yes. Yeah. So sorry, Thomas, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that your point there, though, when you get to a place where, as Chris just reaffirmed, the notion that your theology enters a crisis zone because there are so many interpretations of a particular doctrine that there is no consensus, is usually when the soup starts swelling. And we're seeing this across the board. I mean, it makes me especially understand, I think, a lot better how passionately concerned the early church and the fathers were about orthodoxy, because of the way in which not gaining a certain kind of consensus really opens the door to this flood stream of innovation and emphasis that, we see it with things just more in the wider culture. I mean, what does it mean to be a human?
Right.
Stuff you took for granted.
Right.
Now there's so many definitions of what having an identity is, and the like. And in a way, this is sort of what's going on, like you said, in the theology of our denominations. Questions about what is central to doctrines we once kind of assumed we all shared.
Right. Yeah, there was that theological vacuum, and all kinds of things rushed in to take its place. And so ENC was that step removed, right? We already didn't know what we believed. I mean, ENC has been fishing around for an identity for the last 30 years, right? And I think we concluded that we were a small Christian college on the South Shore. Good for you.
Nothing to die for, though.
Nothing to die. Who's going to die for that, right? But how many times, I can't count. I can't count. How many times did when I wanted to kind of recapture our Wesleyan heritage and talk about Nazarene identity, people said, "Well, Nazarenes don't really know what they believe, anyways, right?" And then, of course, as a justification for their views, right? And they just didn't. They didn't see that there was any dominant narrative that pushed back against them. So they saw that as license to, hey, I'll just teach and believe what I think is the right thing to do, right?
Right. And at the end, I mean, you have crazy stuff happening. You wrote up a little piece for us reflecting on your years at the school. So at the end, I mean, just to give a few examples of what things, what was going on. You don't need to give us any names of people.
No,
you and I know some people that were involved with some of this, and we don't want to embarrass them. But
of course,
just just speak in general terms about the kinds of things that were happening at the end.
Yeah, these are
And it'll be shocking to people who remember ENC from the old days.
right, yeah, and we could recount a number of anecdotes, right? So there's one particular. Well, I'll go back a little bit, Chris, say back to the '90s, right? There's a particular professor in sciences who just embraced and taught the neo-Darwinian version of evolution, right? Which as a topic to discuss in classes, and to engage intellectually, nothing wrong with that, right? But
you need to.
Yes, yeah. Of course. But I think the professor took it a little step further and sort of used some classroom time as a bit of a bully pulpit, right? And you had some conservative students and evangelical students who didn't embrace that particular approach, and kind of took offense, and maybe even this professor offended them a bit, right? Calling him out, and maybe
knowing him, we know him.
Knowing
him, he took great pleasure in doing that. Humiliating people.
But you can't do that. You can't do that to students and expect your constituents to keep sending their kids to you, right? Right. Yes. Engage in questions like that intellectually, right? But when you cross that line and begin to publicly shame or embarrass or, students, that's what happens at ENC doesn't just stay at ENC, It spills over. And then, of course, there was another professor who was involved in literature, taught some of the gen ed stuff, who was kind of radical feminist, right? And took to task, white males and the patriarchy and, and a host of other things. And again, fine, let's talk about it. That's a wonderful topic. How far down the road, what are the issues of feminism? What are the complaints and concerns, right? And what can we do? We're certainly open to that conversation in the Wesleyan tradition. But when you start vilifying people, you start alienating people. I mean, I think I could say this. You could edit it out if you want. But my class followed this particular gen ed class, right? So I would stand at the exit to the side. And students, men and women, would come out of that class just swearing at the professor, right? F this professor, this B, right? And because they felt like it was being thrust down their throats and it was not welcome, and so what do you do when you go to the administration, when that's made known? What do you do? Because you're losing constituents. That gets known, right? And of course, matters related to homosexuality, right? Homosexual marriage and whether that's allowable under in God's eyes, right? And then you start getting sort of this called this more expansive hermeneutic, one of my colleagues embraced, well, in order for us to accept homosexuality as blessed by God, we need to have a more expansive hermeneutic. Well, what do you mean by that, right? I mean,
it's begging the question. They've already let you know what they want.
We need a hermeneutic to fit our doctrine,
which we usually teach and call eisegesis, right? It's
right.
I mean, when a hermeneutic trumps Scripture, then you have an ideology, right? And then of course the some of you know very well that in 2019 or 20, I forget the exact year, that a petition was sent to the administration at Eastern Nazarene College by students who identified themselves as LGBTQ+, and it was just a horrendous document, right? Slander and it was just vulgar, right? The claims that these students made, well, it happened to be signed by a few faculty, right? And supported by some alumni, and that can was kicked down the road, right? Where I felt like maybe the president should have taken on some executive decisions, right? And maybe fired those faculty, right? Or had a good talking to them, right? What are you doing? Taking public positions contrary to the stated positions of the college and the Church Nazarene, and affirming this and encouraging students to do this, right? What's going on here? And this is a breach of your contract, actually, right?
Right. So let's just think a little bit about the situation on the ground at that point. So we have a number of challenging conditions that I think colleges around the country are having to deal with. And I think when you look at the statement that the trustees of Eastern Nazarene College made when they announced the closing, I don't think there's any arguing with some of the things that they state as being difficult to deal with in terms of being able to keep the school going. There are fewer and fewer people who are college age out there and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Nevertheless, I'm on the board of another college, and the college that I'm on the board of is growing. The reason it's growing is because its message is something that people. Well, first of all, the things that particular school stands for are pretty clearly at odds with the general progressive trends of our larger culture, and people who are looking for something beside just the progressive story with a Jesus name on it or a Jesus T-shirt.
Agreed.
They're attracted to that.
Yes.
And then people are making real sacrifices at that school to help it succeed.
Yes.
What you found at ENC at the end was the people who would have, I think, stepped up and done what needed to be done to help the school survive.
Right.
Were so alienated from the school by that point that they thought, well, good riddance.
Yeah.
Sad, but I think many of them felt that way, and it's a real shame based on the fact that the school had a marvelous run, it had good history, it had some wonderful people who worked in it.
Absolutely.
But at the end, it was at a place where it needed people to say, okay, my kid could go to Princeton, but I'm going to send him to ENC because it's my school and I believe the message that the school has to share. But at the end, people weren't doing that.
No.
People were saying, go anywhere else but that place.
Yeah. Well, it's also this notion of loss of confidence in historic Christian convictions. And you see this over and over again. It's the most disappointing thing for a Christian to see, where leaders should be confident in their riches. I'll give you an example. I mean, here, speaking of a Wesleyan who came at it from the other end, Tom Oden.
Yeah.
Look at a figure who had played with just about every type of theology and psychology and everything else to reinterpret the Christian faith. Finally found out that none of them competed at all with the riches that the historic faith had, and started to draw off of that wellspring. And was, at first I think figured maybe I could stay in some of these places and influence them, even in churches, and finally said, no, I can't even sit in some of their communions because of the fact they've so polluted what's going on in that. But here's a person who went against the grain, not a perfect person, but someone who definitely went against the grain and really caught the eye of a lot of other figures trying to push back against it and say, wait a minute, we have something rich that is so rich it's worth defending. I was just thinking, looking before this show, because I do remember I'm up here in Hartford, Connecticut. You should pray for me. But I was thinking of what used to be Hartford Seminary.
Oh, yeah.
And Hartford Seminary used to be somewhat a haven of trying, at least within the main line, of trying to represent. And in 1975, I don't know if you remember, there was an appeal for theological affirmation, which was with, I think, John Newhouse, even had figures like the early Hauerwas and George Lindbeck on it. And listen to the things they were against, but listen to what happens to Hartford. I'm not going to read them all, but just this first one. Theme 1, we're against. Modern thought is superior to all past forms of understanding reality, is therefore normative for Christian faith and life. They're going to go against it. How about this one? The sole purpose of worship is to promote individual self-realization and human community. I mean, that's most evangelical churches today. And so they were trying to tell us a long time ago. And sadly, those institutions, I think, were already too far down the road.
Right. Well,
Hartford Seminary, I mean, is just a... Oh man, it's like a whole
international school of religion now.
That's right.
It was originally founded as a conservative, if I remember my history right. It was originally founded as a conservative alternative to Andover Newton.
Yeah,
and now you're going to get much more Orthodox Islam there than you'll get anything like Orthodox Christianity.
Right. Thinking about Tom Oden brings to mind Will Willimon. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Will Willimon.
Sure. Yeah, he was at Duke Chapel when I was a student there. Yeah.
Right.
So I knew Willimon. I remember we had lunch one day in Cambridge at a little Chinese restaurant I used to go to a lot, and he was in town, and it was actually in town partly to go confront Peter Gomes over at Harvard Chapel when Gomes came out of the closet as homosexual. I don't know if you guys remember that.
I remember, yeah.
And at that point, Willimon, was very much on the same page with Oden, and he was hoping to be able to talk some sense into Gomes and that kind of thing. Anyway, I got word. I have not stayed in touch with Willimon, but I got word through kind of my Methodist connections that Willimon finally gave up and joined the Progressives, and with the recent breakup.
Yeah, he had Gomes actually come speak at the chapel several times when I was a student there.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So I apparently he's not what he was when I knew him.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that's discouraging. You see people, even people that you think would be able to withstand these pressures and trends capitulating.
Right. And that's the concerning part. We've seen it too many times. But in the sociological literature, there's this very dominant theme of secularization, right? And so you get people like Peter Berger, you get Nancy Emmerman, and a host of others who look at Europe and say, look what happened there, right? Modernity, the modern scientific perspective dominated and traditional Christianity died out. But there was always America, the American exceptionalism, right? And so they played with that theme, and there was the common belief that, hey, America somehow is resilient, somehow is going to resist, but we can no longer, hold that thesis, right? So you get this, and I would argue, if I were to do a sociological study of ENC, what happened over the years, it's a classic example of secularization thesis, right?
Yeah.
To be sure, and so within that literature, though, there's this idea that strong churches thrive, strong churches grow, right? As Chris mentioned, the Bible is the Word of God, a traditional biblical worldview. You stay faithful to that. And that's very resilient and was able to resist for a long time. In fact, even Christian Smith, in the 90s, when he wrote that book, what was it? Evangelicalism, Embattled but Thriving, right? Phenomenal book, but now we begin to see even evangelicalism beginning to have that cracks and crevices and succumbing to the spirit of the age. And that cultural Christianity is emerging. And we've got to find ways of pushing back against that and staying firm, because culture is just, no longer supportive of our Christian faith.
Right. So
it's Aaron Wren's Negative World.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the next Touchstone Conference in Chicago is going to be addressing that, and I'll be speaking at that.
Awesome.
So maybe we can just spend the end of the show thinking about what we should do. I mean, what hope do we have that things can be righted, that the tide can be turned, all that kind of stuff? Use any metaphor you want.
I'd like to mention this, Chris, before we jump to that one, is I've noticed in some of the social media, people trying to make the argument that what happened at ENC was only financial, solely financial. either mismanagement or the funds dried up.
Right.
And I want to say no, a loud no to that. That is not the case, because as you and I both know, all four of us know, that the finances and were just a symptom, right?
Right.
That's not the cause.
Right.
We did not die because we didn't have enough money. That's not the case. And I was a pastor of a local church for 14 years, right? When the church members lose faith in the pastor, the leadership, the first thing that closes is the pocketbook, right? Amen, right?
Right.
And then then if it keeps going, they're going to vote with their feet and leave, right? And I think the same thing is true for Eastern Nazarene College. We alienate our constituency, our bread and butter constituency, and whether it's just out of ignorance or whether it was intentional, I'll leave that open question. But we didn't fix that. We were informed of that. Dan Boone from Trevecca. There was a time when Trevecca was going to take ENC under his umbrella, and realizing that we couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. Going to cost too much money. He met with the trustees. He met with the faculty council. I was on faculty council. And he said to us plainly, your constituents believe that you are too liberal. If you don't solve that problem, you are going down. I mean, he was blunt about it, right? And now we know that he was prescient. He was prophetic, right? We didn't hear. We didn't listen. We had ears that did not hear. We didn't change. And lo and behold. So my thesis is correct. It was not purely financial. So, but what do we do about it, Chris? Great question. Yeah. And it seems to me at this point, not many people are interested.
Yeah, well, I think if they're maybe in battle like you are at other schools.
Right.
Just to kind of fill people in, again, Trevecca Nazarene, is it university now?
University.
College still?
Yeah, university.
So that's down in Nashville, and it's a school, obviously, in the same theological tradition. And the hope was that because it was a stronger school, it could take ENC on as and make it kind of like a satellite school. But that all fell apart. And the president of that college was Dan Boone, as you noted. And he gave the diagnosis, and they didn't want to hear what he had to say, or they were unwilling to accept it.
Right.
But I guess that's the thing that's worth considering. Why is it that people are unwilling to accept what other people can clearly see?
Right.
And obviously, he was right. You were right. I was right. I made the call.
You did a long time ago. Chris Wiley was right decades ago. I'm say that.
I'm glad you're there to say that. There's not many people who would. But anyway, but I'm saddened by the event. I mean, even though I'm no longer in the Church of the Nazarene, I have these marvelous memories of the place and great affection for the people I knew when I was there, faculty, even people I disagreed with. I mean, it's a real shame. It's just such a shame to see that, and it's happening at other schools. I mean, it's not as though Gordon College is all that healthy.
No,
I mean, I know they're struggling as well. I mean, you look around. Maybe there are a handful of Christian colleges that are kind of historic in character, like Wheaton, that are going to be able to weather this storm, but many will not.
Right.
And if they're going to survive, they can't just pretend that you can alienate your constituency, the people who will send their children to the school and make the donations to the school, and expect to survive.
Right.
It's just nuts.
And I'm with you, Chris. I mean, my heart goes out when I talk about this. I know my voice sharpens a little bit. I get emphatic because I want to make a point, right? From my perspective. But these are folks I love. They're colleagues and friends, right? And now they're really hurting. And sometimes it was some occasions when, both husband and wife were working at the college. So their income is gone, and they have to make some hard choices now, as many of us do. And so my heart goes out, but I think I want that message to be heard. This could have been stopped. Now, would ENC have been like thriving over the top? No, probably not. But we could have, if not limped along, we could have walked pretty nicely along the way if we could have recaptured the hearts of our pastors and at least explained to them. And I think that's one point, Chris, is the communication dried up. And if even ENC faculty administration had met with pastors, really talked frankly about it. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to teach my kids, right? And what's your motivation? And had a conversation, but we rarely had that at ENC, and that didn't help.
Yeah, it's a shame. Anyway, we're getting to the point where we should, wrap things up a bit. Glenn and Tom, you have experiences with other institutions and maybe some things you'd like to share about your concerns, kind of generally speaking, for higher education in the evangelical world. Any thoughts, Glenn?
Well, I'm looking at this from a bigger picture. I think we're looking at the collapse of evangelicalism broadly. Evangelicalism is in the process of self-destructing.
Wow.
And what we need to be thinking of, from my perspective, is broader than individual institutions. It's what are we going to replace it with?
Right.
What is going to be the face of faithful Christianity in the wake of the collapse of evangelicalism?
Right.
Somebody made a point, I forgot who it was. Liberal theology doesn't really exist in the sense that it's a completely unstable thing.
Yeah.
What liberals were talking about 20 years ago is not what they're talking about now. It's just whichever way the wind is blowing.
Agreed.
There is no such thing as a liberal theology because there's no consistency in it.
Agreed.
And unfortunately, that's the way evangelicalism is going. So the question is, what's going to replace it, and how do we move in that direction? And that may involve revitalizing institutions. It may involve new institutions. I'm not sure which. But I honestly think that's what we need to be thinking about. That's really the core problem.
Right. Yeah, ENC provides us with a case study. But the phenomenon that we're talking about here is much larger.
Amen.
Tom, any thoughts?
I mean, especially on the graduate level, where I kind of I get to see what formation people have went through the universities they've come from, and I am still just almost shocked at how most of the core convictions that they embrace when they come into, study theology and Christian ethics, they have no clue of the history of the ideas they're committed to.
Right.
Oftentimes the shallowness of them and how at odds they are fundamentally with historic Christian convictions.
Right.
It's a lot of work to just do the mining to show them why that's the case. It's a lot more work to build a constructive Christian alternative under the conditions of our time. But that is something I think we have to be up to. That's a long-term goal, but it's something we have to be up to show people that the stuff they're getting has a history, and a bad one at that.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, Phil, we want to give you the last word. Anything you want to say as we conclude?
Well, one thing we've learned a lot about is the power and influence of the social. When your wife was growing up and my wife was growing up in the church, they spent hours, at church, and that helped cultivate. So how do we sustain today an evangelical culture when we're at church together for an hour and a half and 2 hours, and this goes all the way back to Alistair McIntyre, after Virtue.
Right.
We've got to rebuild those structures, but I'm afraid cultures, that secular culture, really pagan culture, really, is not going to let us, and it's not going to be easy. But that's where it gets rough, and this is where, we get filtered out. Who's serious about this, right?
Right.
But I have questions now. What am I going to do? And
sure.
Who's going to be faithful? Will my church be faithful? Yes.
Right.
The General Assembly of 2023 drew a line in the cultural sand, where a conservative evangelical holiness denomination, at least on paper, and it's been affirmed. But now are we going to leverage that? And are we going to keep that going.
Yeah, to give you a little bit of hope here, the General Assembly and the PCA, which meets annually as opposed to the way things are done in the Nazarene World, where it's just every 4 years, has had its kind of crisis moment back in 2018. I call it the debacle in Dallas. But after that, the conservatives rallied, and it's been a refreshing change over these last few years. So we see some, I think, good things going on in the PCA. I think we see some things that are encouraging in the SBC even. And I'm hopeful that the Nazarenes will be able to clean house and kind of pull themselves together. So,
can we do it?
You know, I'm grateful that God used the Church of the Nazarene in my life. I wish it well, even though I'm not a part of it any longer. But anyway, it's great to see you, Phil. You know, I think last time we were together, it's been a few years in person anyway, but it's great to see you here online.
Thank you. Always good to be with you, Chris, and I appreciate, our conversations and your wisdom. It's always enlightening and entertaining, right? Tom and Glenn, thank you. I watch you guys, on the podcast, and I love you guys. Thank you. And it's really a wonderful privilege for me to be here with you, so it's great. And thanks for being concerned about this, the issue with the Church Nazarene. Obviously, it's going to continue. Other schools will face this issue, and we haven't even reached the 2025 cliff yet, right?
The cliff meaning the student population drop off. Right.
And coming down the pike, so we have to be prayed up and get ready for this. Thank you, folks.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for listening to the podcast and this episode. And we have ways for folks to support the show. One of those ways is through our Patreon page. If you'd like to support us, Phil, by the way, is a supporter.
Yes. Proud support.
And if you'd like to join Phil and the others, you can just go to the link in the show notes and do that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.